It is a privilege for me to share with you during these days. I bring greetings from Mennonite World Conference, which is a global community of faith that brings together Mennonites and other Anabaptist groups from all over the world. And again, it's a blessing for me to share with you during these days. The first thought that comes to my mind when I hear the words religious freedom has to do with a memory of a worship service in my church in Bogota, Colombia, when I was 11 years old. I was part of a small congregation that was worshiping God when several stones hit the door of the building. I remember the sound of glass breaking and people yelling. We stopped singing, petrified with fear. However, many things have changed in my country since those days. The days in which our church was persecuted are in the past. As a matter of fact, today the non-Catholic churches are regarded as an important political force capable of changing the outcome of elections, as we saw in the last plebiscite about the peace agreements between the government of Colombia and the Revolutionary Army of Las FARC. It is in that context that I want to reflect during this time on how the Christian faith can facilitate and promote peaceful coexistence among all citizens. As we Christians know, at the core of our convictions is a belief in the church as people of reconciliation, 2 Corinthians chapter 5. The church is called to bring the message of reconciliation with God and among human beings. However, the method of how that message is introduced has not always been consistent with the fruit that we are looking for. When we analyze the history of the church, we can identify several ways in which the church has responded to such responsibility. Several ways in which the role of the church as people of reconciliation has been understood vis-a-vis society. The first of them can be called conversionists. It has to do with the belief that the only thing that we need in order to transform a society is to have a few converted Christians in positions of political power. The second option, which might be called transformationalist, if that is a word in English, seeks to transform a society by changing its structures of power through the implementation of Christian values. A third option, the separatist impulse, has to do with withdrawing from society while denying any possibility of fundamental social transformation. I want to suggest here that from a Mennonite perspective, there is another possibility. This possibility seeks to bring about the transformation of a society by considering the church as an alternative society that is called to be a voluntary and peripheral community. So let's talk first about the church as alternative society, and it's called to be a voluntary community. The historian William Estep explains how in the Radical Reformation, the separation of church and state was viewed as necessary because of the nature of the church. Only thus could the church be cleansed and freed to be the church under God. That is establishment of the state churches was for the Anabaptists the minimum requirement in a guarantee of religious freedom. Ultimately, The Anabaptist movement for religious freedom received its greatest motivation from the conviction that faith cannot be coerced. For the Anabaptists of the 16th century, the response of faith led immediately to fellowship in a community of believers through baptism. The voluntary, free decision to follow Christ was demonstrated through baptism, which at the same time was the point of entrance into the church. This is a reason why the doctrine of the church was central to Anabaptist theology. The church was to be visible, the visible body of Christ, explains the historian Arnold Snyder. This, of course, implied that the church consisted of believers who had decided in a voluntary way to form a new community. This way of understanding Christian faith and church required the freedom to choose your own confession of faith, your own values, even the ethics that will characterize your life, the education that you want for your children, and your lifestyle as Christian. It also implied that there will be people who will choose differently from those who decide to follow Christ. In order to ensure the existence of the church, there must be freedom and the possibility of saying no to Christian faith, to Christian values, and to Christian lifestyle. Without freedom and a guarantee of freely living out decisions about faith and ethics, there won't be a real church. In the words of Estep, the Anabaptists were not interested in constructing a church through coercion, either by infant baptism or by the power of the magistrate. They were concerned with gathering a church of believers who had freely responded to the proclamation of the gospel. This way of thinking rejects the idea of depending on human governments to promote the Christian faith, its values, or even its way of living. Indeed, looking for ways of getting legal religious privileges over other faiths is fundamentally incompatible with this perspective. In contexts like Colombia, our churches need to recover this vision. Very often, there, we find people speaking about Colombia as a Christian country, or promoting the approval of laws that reflect Christian values, but are actually oppressive for people who don't share the same convictions. Although Christians are called to promote general morality in society, this cannot be done by imposition of specific Christian values over people who are not Christians, even if they are a minority. This is a reason why I see with deep concern the current movement of Christians in my country who are trying to impose their understanding of Christian ethics over our society without taking into account that Christian ethics, a life that reflects the transforming gift of God's grace in the Christian disciple, is not for Buddhists, Muslims, Jewish, or non-religious people, but for Christians. In the words of the Mennonite theologian John Howard Yoder, we need to distinguish between the ethics of discipleship, which are laid upon every Christian believer by virtue of his very confession of faith, and an ethic of justice within the limits of relative prudence and self-preservation, which is all one can ask of the larger society. Otherwise, as with my experience as a child, the freedom of Christians to practice Christian values could also be threatened if, in a different scenario, the majority of a society were not Christians. Safeguarding the freedom of all minorities guarantees the freedom of Christians as well. The legislation and practice of ethics in a society must be something that takes into account the position of Christians, Muslims, Buddhists, Jewish, non-religious people, and people of any other religion. It must not be done by the imposition of force on majorities, but as the result of dialogue, agreements, and consensus among the members of that society. Once again, let us remember, as Yoder affirms, that Christian ethics is for Christians. Let's talk now about the church as an alternative society and its call to be a peripheral community. Anabaptists affirm the centrality of the church in God's strategic plan of social transformation. As the theologian Stanley Hauerwas says, this church knows that its most credible form of witness and the most effective thing it can do for the world is the actual creation of a living, breathing, visible community of faith. Social transformation, as I said before, cannot be done by the imposition of ethics of Christian governors or by the tyranny of a majority in a democracy. As we can see in the scriptures, with the creation of Israel, the biblical method of social transformation had to do with the formation of an alternative society that lives out a new way of ethics and values that, like a magnet, would attract others. You can see this, for instance, in Deuteronomy chapter 4, verses 5 through 8. In the words of the Mennonite theologian Alan Epp Weaver, by embodying an alternative way of life through faithful practices, the people of Israel attracts others to God's vision of shalom for the world. It follows that this social ethic of transformation has to do more with a communal witness embodied by God's people than with a top-down exercise of power, control, and imposition. This may be a reason why Jesus, in his use of the scriptures, identified himself with Daniel more than with King David, with the Israel of the exile more than with Israel's kingdom. Israel's tradition of wisdom, nonconformity, and mission in exile was the preferred model used by Jesus, rather than the monarchy or the Exodus. The Israel of the exile was a people without land or nationalism. It was a community of displaced people, a confessional community more than a political kingdom. In this context, Israel became a resistant community with a strong identity that has many important lessons for the church in this post-Constantinian era. Living and offering a true social alternative is the way of survival in our current Babylon. Jesus' example invites us to look for ways of transforming our societies from the bottom upwards. The world cannot be set right from the top, says Yoder. It requires the witness of a vulnerable community that is not in charge, that exercise a radical dependence on God alone. As long as the church oppresses minorities by imposing Christian values and keeps relying on Christian politicians in order to promote their religion and their values, societies like Colombia will continue rejecting the message of a crucified God who invites us without coercion to love God and love each other. As Yoder affirms, those who seek to gain power in order to implement their religious vision have chosen, probably consciously, a strategy hardly reconcilable with that of the New Testament church. The transformative witness of the church to the state will bear fruit when the church promotes the religious freedom of others, even when we disagree with them. The church's witness will be effective when it promotes social ethics by consensus and dialogue with other faiths and with people of no faith. It will be effective because only in this way will the church, as a peripheral community, as a community that is not in charge, be able to evidence grace for those that do not agree with it. It is in this way where real compassion can be evidenced. When you discuss with others face to face in real interaction and look for the reasons why others disagree with your ethics in a spirit of humility and empathy, of being in the shoes of others, only there can the seed of Christian transformation take root. Christianity must find a way to articulate a viable, trans or non-national or diasporic faith, points out the Quaker theologian Daniel Smith Christopher. I will say that in addition to a diasporic faith, we need to articulate an understanding of the church whose witness is evident in the grace that it extends to those who do not hold power, and to the integrity of its ethic of vulnerable love and generosity. This is my prayer for our churches in Colombia. Thank you very much.